Good morning. I am calling to order our regularly scheduled meeting of the Committee of the Whole. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I'm the chair of this committee. And I'm joined today by colleagues, council members Gordon, Reich, Andrew Johnson, Yang, Quincy, Warsami, and Palmisano, and we are a quorum of this body and able to do business. So we have one discussion item on our agenda for today. This is an item that is returning to this committee after an initial discussion a couple of cycles ago, and then continuing discussions both at the HECE meeting and with individual council members. And the discussion is regarding the proposal for adopting Minneapolis community indicators. And so I will invite whomever, Kim Keller, from the coordinator's office to come through and lead us through a presentation of where is this proposal at today.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Glidden, council members. Each of you should have received via email a copy of the presentation, which I will be giving today. You also should have a hard copy in front of you, as well as a supplementary material that clearly shows any changes that are being proposed to the original proposal. As a brief overview, I want to review the goals of the project. We have developed community indicators in order to quantitatively measure our qualitative goals. They have also been developed as a response to a staff direction. Since our goals are aspirational, it makes sense that our indicators of their success are also big picture in nature. Our goals were not limited to the scope of the work of the city, government, and neither are our community indicators. They help us understand the lived experience of those in our community. It is important to point out that this process involved difficult decisions and compromise. The number of proposed indicators was limited in order to provide some focus, and in part due to the capacity of staff, both departmental and from the city coordinator's office, to develop the type of robust full reports that we envision. So what are some characteristics of community indicators? These broad community bellwethers help us to understand the direction our community is moving. Because they are based on community input, they also represent key factors people living or working in Minneapolis care about. By taking a broad definition of sustainability, our sustainability indicators measured much more than simply the environment. The community indicators are intended to build upon that and measure all 5 of our city goals. Because community members do not think in terms of city programs or even what technically falls within the scope of city government or not, they often prefer community indicators. There are also things that community indicators are not intended to be. They are not intended to be the only data points that we look to understand if we're meeting city goals. They are not meant to remain static over time. As new measures become available, we will update the indicators. They are not meant to measure city enterprise outputs, although we will be doing so in the reports. And they are not overly technical in nature or require insider knowledge of how a program operates in order to understand. Over the past month, a sizable body of work has been completed. Through our city coordinator, committee chairs were contacted about the subset of indicators most relevant to their committee work. As a result, a number of indicators were reviewed in detail in HECE. And finally, 6 indicator topics were identified by council members as needing additional work. Our office partnered with internal subject matter experts and external experts to refine those specific indicators and review the proposed changes with council members. At the August COW meeting, I was also asked to develop a plan for updating community indicators as new information becomes available. We've determined that for the subset of indicators that are still being finalized, such as those based on resident survey questions, we will come back in the near future for approval. After that point, we will review the community indicators every 2 years and bring those that are recommended for updating through committee, just as was done with the sustainability indicators. This slide summarizes the proposed changes to the indicators. As you can see, some of the measures have been completely replaced while others are modified. There are also 2 situations in which it was felt that the topic had nuances within it that could not be covered in a single measure. In those situations, a second measure was added. The next slide The next series of slides does a deeper dive into those proposed changes before we come back up to review the body of work as a whole. First, I'll just walk you briefly through the slide layout. On the top left, you'll see details about how we'll measure the indicator itself and our anticipated data source. This is followed by primary considerations that were taken in choosing this indicator, including any rationale, limitations, trade-offs. On the right-hand side, we note if this was a sustainability indicator, related ideas that arose through community engagement, and where possible, we included a concept visual to demonstrate how this might look. I want to point out that the two sections in the middle of the left-hand side of the slides, those potential contextual measures and determinants in the related departments are still draft. That is a large part of the work in reporting, is doing the research to determine what unique context this indicator lives in. And so those are draft. And we will continue to engage departments, community partners, and do research in order to adapt those. So commute mode share replaces a measure detailing access to transportation alternatives. In conversations with council members and at HECE, the point was made that the ultimate measure in this area is one of behavior, and that the access measure we had developed is really a determinant of whether individuals make the switch from driving alone to work to an alternate form of transportation. Therefore, we will still have the conversation about access in our report on commute mode share. This is also a sustainability indicator. The cost-burned households measure is adapted from its initial form after recommendation from Councilmember Goodman that the measure be tied to income. To do this, we worked closely with CPED Housing and together selected the Metropolitan Council's bands of affordability, which are less than 30% AMI, 31 to 50% AMI, and 51 to 80% AMI. In reporting on this measure, we anticipate discussing a variety of issues, including employment rates, wages and income, housing supply, and demand factors, as well as investments the city is making in this area, such as through the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. The Quality Housing Infrastructure Indicator is brand new and replaces one that was more limited in scope. The original measure was for rental housing that does not meet the standards we set as a city and council members. And council members at HECE felt that it was too narrow. In conversations with CPED and regulatory services, we learned that a housing condition inventory is being developed, which could be analyzed to answer a variety of policy questions. The new recommendation is to engage the Comprehensive Plans Housing Task Force in developing the best measure for our housing infrastructure. This measure on trust is also a replacement. At HECE, council members expressed interest in widening the scope of the initial proposal, which focused on resident opportunities to participate in city decision-making. The point was made that participation leads to trust. Research into how to build trust generated 4 main concepts: respect, fair treatment, transparency, and having a voice in decisions. As this is a resident survey question, we do anticipate that the wording may evolve. When reporting on this measure, we will be able to pull in activities from across the enterprise and well beyond NCR's work, from regulatory services' new proactive way of conducting nuisance sweeps to finance and property services financial transparency work and the voter engagement efforts of our elections department among them. The Laurie Index measure itself that is in front of you has not changed from the original proposal. There is a complementary second measure on the next slide. Because these measures are taken in concert, I thought that it would be helpful to briefly review the Laurie measure. So the Lake Aesthetic and User Recreation Index, otherwise known as Laurie, covers Minneapolis's 8 swimming lakes. This measure comes from the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board and has 5 components, among them public health, habitat, aesthetics, habitat quality, water clarity, and recreation access. The second of our Healthy Lakes, Streams, and Rivers measure resurrects a former sustainability measure, impaired water bodies. This measure calls out bacteria, and a variety of pollutants in the city's water bodies. Staff has discussed reporting on all of the federally designated impairments, but limiting the scope of the progress conference to those couple that could be affected the most by actions taken by the city. Resident rating of proximity to parks that meet their households' needs was the original proposed community indicator. In conversations with policymakers, the point was made that this measure does not adequately capture the experience of being surrounded by green space. Therefore, we are proposing 2 measures are included as community indicators to measure access to green space. This one in front of you, proximity to parks that meet household needs, is intended to cover the experience of residents once they are inside of a park, such as programming, facilities, and safety. The second measure is meant to capture the experience of being in a city that values green space and tree canopy. The percentage of Minneapolis land with access to green space in one of 3 tiers is determined by proximity to public green space and neighborhood level tree canopy. Areas that have high levels of both are considered to be good. Those that have one but not the other have limited access, and those that do not have access to either would be termed low access to green space. Now that we have gone into the proposed changes in detail, I'll spend some time presenting the entire package of indicators. While the indicators on the following slides are grouped into our city goals, it's important to acknowledge that many of them could be cross-listed. We have not done so in order to provide a clean copy for you to review. Further, in reporting them, we will of course be supplementing them with additional data. So the indicator itself is in the second column, with the various ways the data will be cut in the right-hand column. This goal in front of you, Living Well, focuses on safety, livability, and ensuring residents have the ability to access amenities and connect with each other. The measures of this goal are commute mode share, housing that is both affordable and safe, the completeness of our neighborhoods, safety, and creative vitality. The One Minneapolis goal emphasizes people and specifically eliminating disparities. The measures before you focus on unemployment, the poverty rate, residents' trust of Minneapolis city government, healthy food access, low-level crime arrests, reading proficiency, hospitalization from asthma, and the infant mortality rate. The Hub of Economic Activity and Innovation goal was built around businesses and employees and ensuring that they have the support they need to start, move, stay, and grow here in Minneapolis. The first measures on the slide focus on the overall economy and include the employment size of our largest 20 employment sectors, sales and use tax that is generated, and the number of employees working in business startups. The last 2 measures focus on the workforce. Workforce measures are recommended to be educational attainment of adults age 25 and older, and average monthly earnings of those with stable jobs. The Great Places goal centers on environmental protection, our city infrastructure, such as our roads and bridges, and green spaces. The recommended measures here include air quality, healthy lakes, streams, and rivers, measured, of course, by the Lowry score for our lakes, and water body impairments for the lakes, creeks, wetlands, and the Mississippi River, our waste stream and how it is disposed of, greenhouse gas emissions across the city, residents' access to parks and green space, once again with 2 measures, the perception of parks in close proximity to residents, and access to public green space and tree canopy, and the quality of our roads and bridges. And finally, A City That Works goal faces inward to the city enterprise, focusing on how effectively we offer services and how we connect to the community. These measures have not changed since the initial proposal and include overall resident satisfaction with city services, an engagement score for our city employees, resident rating on how easily they can access information about city services and programs, the diversity of our city workforce, and residents' rating for the value they receive for their tax dollar. Thank you for your time this morning. If there are any questions, I would be happy to address them.
All right. Are there questions or comments? I know that there were a number of council members who engaged in a pretty thorough one-on-one with staff, so it'd be good to kind of hear if there's any feedback that you'd like to share publicly about whether things are at kind of a state that we can move forward with. I see both Councilmember Gordon and Councilmember Goodman. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. appreciate the council and the coordinator's office patience in letting us delay this for a little while and work on it. We actually took the time to have a health, environment, and community engagement policy discussion about it, where department heads came in and I got to talk to them along with representatives, and then we also talked about it at our committee. So I think we were able to make significant improvements, or at least tweaks to satisfy me more if they're not significant improvements. So on a number of these, I appreciate it. It also gave me an opportunity to learn more about what these indicators are and what they mean at other places. I got to review Seattle's, I got to review Star Communities, and there's this whole packet of international smart city indicators that are very interesting, and I found very informative. So I'm willing to support this as we move forward today. There's a couple things I'll still miss, and I know that we're going to be tracking low birth weight, at least as part of the infant mortality. I also want to highlight an indicator that I noticed in a lot of places that I think that I might try to keep moving us towards in the future, which is simply life expectancy. Interestingly enough, in the city of Minneapolis, the life expectancy is very different depending on the zip code you're born in, for example. And life expectancy to me it includes infant mortality and infant deaths, but it also looks at everybody and how we impact that. And I think it gets to some of those things that we also work really hard on in terms of healthy living and obesity and diabetes, and how can we look at what some of the things are. But I'm not prepared. I don't want to keep rocking this boat necessarily to make any amendments right now. I really appreciate this work. I'm just so delighted to see that we're looking at mode share when it comes to transportation, not just how close you are to it. Also that we're looking at our rivers and other water bodies and not just our lakes. Kind of the aesthetic Lori index is fine, but really I think we should be more concerned about how much chlorides, bacteria, E. coli, what's going on in our river. We want to be able to make sure that those are good for fishing and swimming and recreation or whatever people want to use them for. And we have an opportunity to impact that. So I appreciate all the work. I also appreciate that we looked more at the housing issue. I know that was one that I had just looking at the tiers. We left off all home ownership and so much when we weren't doing a little more. So hopefully that will turn out pretty well. I will note also that I'm just have a philosophical concern about using our resident survey as our indicators. I think our resident survey stands alone as here's what the residents think and feel about the city, and it's a great thing to have, but I don't know if we want resident perceptions to be our indicators. I'd rather them be actual objective measures that we can take, which most of them are. So I'm even hoping the one about community involvement and trust might actually have a companion measure so we can somehow say, here's some objective evidence that residents actually think their government does work for them because they're doing this or that. But so it's a good work in progress. And ultimately, my last thing is I'm really excited to see our Results Minneapolis get up and running again, and we can start having our conferences and our measures and reporting to the public and to ourselves about how well we're doing. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Gordon. Councilmember Goodman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm glad to hear Councilmember Gordon's enthusiasm for the process. I don't really share it. I'm somewhat skeptical about whether or not these indicators are going to actually do anything to inform our work or not, but we can feel good about it and say we're going to put it out there. It sounds like everyone's okay with that. I looked at the two housing indicators and would say that, great, we added the word infrastructure. So now we're talking not just about tier 1 and tier 2, but we're talking about infrastructure because no one knows what tier 1 and tier 2 mean unless you're a rental housing owner. Okay, that's fine with me. I don't have any objection to it. I was more involved in the conversation with regard to the cost burden households. I probably would have approached it a little differently, kind of taking a look at the homeless census from Wilder, trying to figure out what the region is doing as well as the city is doing and what we're doing as a percentage of the region with regard to cost burden households. I probably would have looked at how many units we're saying we're going to build versus St. Paul versus the suburbs. But this is a definite improvement to at least add the terminology that we already use, which is 30, 50, and 60 or 80% of the metro-wide median. I think it makes more sense than just the same statement, percentage of households that pay more than 30% of their gross income for housing. I think we have to explain what that is a little bit better. So, I mean, I think we understand as an enterprise, and certainly CPED understands that as an enterprise what the problem is, and we as policymakers also understand what the problem is. And the business plan at CPED does work to address through the mayor's budget issues of affordable housing. So I feel fairly confident at the goals, tactics, strategies level, we know what we're doing. So I'm not going to pay too much attention to how we're going to measure it, what the language is with regard to measuring it, because I think I know from serving on the Family Housing Fund Board and looking at the regional analysis of units stabilized and units built that we're doing much more than everybody else. Obviously why Myron's mad at us, because we're doing much more than everybody else. And I think that's good, the fact that we're doing much more than everybody else. And I don't want to be backed into a corner and said, we're doing more than our fair share, make the suburbs do some. We should do more than our fair share, and the suburbs should do some. So I'm not a huge fan of this particular process, but I feel very confident that CPED and the folks at CPED Housing know what they're doing and will continue to march on based on the direction of the Community Development Committee and with the blessing of the full council.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Any other comments? Well, I wanted to say a thank you to staff for hearing thoughts from council members and then taking additional time to engage, present at another committee, and work to try to incorporate some recommended changes to get this to a product where I think there's more confidence from the council in it, and it sounds like there is. I was one of the ones who had several indicators that I engaged with Ms. Keller about, and I know that she and broad staff team really looked hard at those suggestions and how to tweak some of the indicators to both either make them broader or sometimes add more specificity. I guess my concern has been how do we incorporate some feedback? So I think that was good. People actually raised their questions in public, and we had a chance to incorporate some of that feedback, and I believe that has been incorporated. And I also want to ensure we're able to move forward and no longer pause our results, Minneapolis or other major processes that keep us on track. So I appreciate the work to get us to this point. This is, I will go ahead and make a motion to approve this. And the motion I'm making is in regards to the revised proposal that is now before us. We didn't have any motion from last meeting, so this doesn't need to be an amendment or a substitute. It's just a motion of this particular proposal. Any discussion on this? Seeing none, on approval, please say aye. 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 Opposed, and that item is approved. Thank you very much. So with that, we have concluded with the one discussion item for Committee of the Whole, and now we'll turn to reports of committees. The first is Community Development and Regulatory Services, and I will turn it over to Councilmember Goodman, and I will note that I'd asked if Mr. Mercer and Mr. Lutz or others who are familiar with the Commons project could be available, because I think there will be some questions about that project after you go through your agenda.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. There are 9 items for community development to be approved on Friday. Item number 1 is the regular license applications. Item number 2 is license operating conditions for a taxi cab. Item 3 is operating conditions for the 4th Street Saloon. Item 4 is a rental license operating conditions. And item 5 is a license settlement conference. Item number 6 is a bond issuance for the National Bone Marrow Program. Item number 7 is negotiating the rights for 800 South Washington with M.A. Mortensen for a period of 6 months. Item number 8 is a partnership with the NEA for the Our Town program. 2 projects have been picked, including the Pangea World Theater on Lake Street and the West Broadway Area Coalition for the West Broadway Creative Hub. And item number 9 is the Commons design, approval, and implementation. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions on those items before you move on to your next portion.
Okay. And I just want to note, maybe I have an old book, but my book said there were 14 items, and it just, so maybe that's a note to the clerk that Whatever you're reading seems a little different from something that's in our.
The clerk gave me the agenda, so that's what I read
Okay.
off of.
Anyway, just a note, maybe seems like it's a different numbered list than what's
I
in our
bet we
book.
approved some licenses too.
Okay.
I'm not sure
there's
if
some of
they're all
that.
under one.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to ask if, I don't know if it's Mr. Mercer or Mr. Lutz or who would like to come and maybe tell us a little bit about this Commons project and then perhaps take a couple questions.
Oh, but we only have 9 items.
Vice President Glidden, council members, my name is Miles Mercer. I'm with the city's Community Planning Economic Development Department. I've been the project coordinator for the Downtown East project, which has most recently involved a lot of work around the Downtown East Commons. So the item that the Community Development Regulatory Services Committee heard on August 25th basically tried to accomplish 2 things. One was to seek City Council approval for approving the concept design of the Commons. So as you may know, we've been having an extensive community engagement process throughout the beginning part of this year with many community meetings, stakeholder input. Been working with a landscape architectural team led by Hargraves Associates. All of that work, community engagement work, design work, led at the end of May this year with the release of a concept design for the Commons. And the images for that concept design are attached to the council action. It includes some plan view as well as some renderings of what the Commons may look like. And so in the committee meeting 2 Fridays ago, I talked through some of those design elements. So that's the first main thing that this action does. The second main thing is it seeks approval for some terms for agreements that the city would enter into with Green Minneapolis and with Ryan companies. So these would be agreements with Green Minneapolis to fund a scope of improvements to start to implement some of the pictures and images and design that you see of the Commons, and also an agreement with Ryan companies to actually do the construction work for this. It's important to note that the design process and the construction process, we've broken it into some different packages, some different phases. And so what we're talking about in this council action is phase 1 or package 1, which is largely the underground work, the subsurface work, putting in the right utilities. And that work would occur this fall. And a reason for that is because if you look outside, you can see that the Star Tribune building is coming down. And as Ryan Companies is excavating that basement, before they fill it back in, we would like to put in the right pipes, the right wiring, the right conduit, since the site is open. And so what this action would do is allow Ryan to install that subgrade work, that infrastructure work that Hargraves has designed that enables the design that would occur on the surface. So one reason why we sought approval just for this package 1 work is 1, because of the time sensitivity of it, that would occur this fall. And 2, because that's what we have money for. So last month, there was an announcement that the fundraising committee for the Commons had raised $7 million. And so that a portion of that $7 million will pay for the construction work, which is approximately $3.5 million. And so that is what we have enough money for. And so that's what we'd be contracting with Ryan at this point to build out, is to install the underground work for which we have that money.
So, and I do have a couple questions, so maybe I'll just kind of put these out there. But also, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what's on the list of what's actually approved, because when I'm reading this action, it says in your narrative description that yes, as you just said, the fundraising committee had announced its first round of cash and in-kind commitments from the Commons totaling $7 million. And then it says the city is funding $2 million of this amount through approved contracts for design and project management costs.
Right.
So what's the city council approval process for that? Because I want to make sure I'm understanding which item on this list for a CD authorized the $2 million that goes to this fundraising campaign.
Right. Vice President Glidden, I'll start with an answer, and then I might ask finance to come up to
Okay,
as well.
yeah, and that would help, because I know this
So-
item also didn't go to Ways and Means, and some of us
Sure.
had questions just
Sure.
about why that was the case, because usually when money passes through hands, there is a council committee approval of that.
So first, I'll just talk about the 2 million, about what it is. So to implement the broader design of the commons, there's hard costs, but then there's also soft costs. So the 2 million consists of at least basically two things. One is the cost of Hargraves Associates, who's the landscape architect design team. We have a contract with them that City Council approved in January of this year for an amount not to exceed $1.8 million. So that is 1.8 million of the 2 million. The remaining,
But
Yep.
when we approved that, did we say that we were eating that cost? I just want to make sure I'm understanding, again, what was happening. Okay, so let's, thank you. I think there will be time to kind of go, but yes, this actually is the question, is what did the council approve if you're counting that as part of the
Right.
$2 million for the fundraising?
so I think if you look back at the council report from January,
What's the date on the report so I can pull that up?
January 14th.
January 14th, and maybe the clerk could help us find that. Okay, if you want to email it.
Madam Vice President, so what that action did was a recommendation to authorize appropriate staff to enter into a contract with Hargraves for the design of the downtown East Commons, an amount not to exceed $1.8 million. And
So
in the,
did
and
it-
in, and in
okay.
the, and then in continuing it on in the financial impact section of that, what it talked about is staff is working with all interested parties to develop and execute a fundraising strategy for all aspects of the commons development. So that's a reference to the fundraising effort. It says, until this strategy is fully developed and funds are raised, the city will pay for, on an interim basis, the costs incurred under the contract with Hargraves Associates. All funds are raised and become available. As funds are raised and become available, the city will be reimbursed for the costs it paid for under this contract. I'll just read that part again. As funds are raised and become available, the city will be reimbursed for the costs it paid for under this contract. Sufficient resources are available in the project budget to provide for this interim financing.
Okay,
that's verbatim what
I'll
that
just say,
says.
maybe this is a question for the city attorney, but I don't read that as we gave an authorization that the money has been donated. I read that differently than how it seems you're interpreting it today. So it says that, to me, that you are going to come back and ask us, the council, about what may happen in the future depending on the fundraising campaign.
Right. Madam Vice President, I would say, and that's what this action is doing. It's coming back to you and asking for affirmation that
And which of the four actions authorizes the donation of $1.8 million for the Hargrave?
So, Madam Vice President, in the committee action, the
Yep.
amendment was, or the action was amended. So there was a fifth action
Oh, okay.
added in,
My
affirming that the
apologies.
city would not be replenished, that the $2 million would not be replenished.
Okay.
And in addition, in the term sheet, it talks about that that's what the city's contribution would be.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And there are two people in queue, but I just had one additional question that's almost kind of like a framing question that I want to ask. And I may have an additional question from Ms. Christensen about why this item that has a financial implication did not go to Ways and Means. But how much money total, just because this is kind of a long process that started in the last term, and so I feel like I have followed this for a long time. But how much money total has the city contributed or invested in the commons?
Madam Vice President, so starting with the broader Downtown East deal that the City Council authorized December 2013, what that authorization did is the city issued bonds. And there was three things that the city issued bonds to pay for. One was the commons, another was the parking to help pay for the parking ramp, and the third bucket was some other site costs to prepare the Downtown East Commons site. I'm sorry, the Downtown East site. So in that first bucket, the commons, what the arrangement was is that the city was going to purchase the Commons property from Ryan Companies. So Ryan Companies currently owns the land today out there. And the city would make that purchase by July 1st, 2016, so by this upcoming July, and would pay Ryan Companies a stipulated amount of $19.8 million. There's a couple different funding sources for that 19.8. The city had a bigger bond issuance of over $60 million for all those three buckets. For the part that goes to the Commons, it was approximately $18.8 million. So the city issued bonds of about approximately $18.8 million for that upfront acquisition and basic site preparation for the Downtown East Commons. Now, I think it's important to note that as part of the broader Downtown East deal, that the payments, that the city has some sources of repayment for that bond issuance, for that $61 million bond issuance, which includes the 18.8 for the Commons. For at least the first 10 years, Ryan Companies is set to make a stream of guaranteed payments to the city of Minneapolis. And the bond structure, the bond payments were structured such that those payments matched what Ryan Companies is set to pay. So at least approximately for the first 10 years, the city's bond debt service is covered. After that point, the revenue from the two ramps, meaning the two ramps that the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority controls, those ramps being the underground Downtown East ramp that's underneath where the light rail station is today. So that's the existing ramp. And then there's a second ramp that's under construction now. That's just to the north of that block. That's the new ramp that will be owned by the MSFA. Those two ramps are producing parking revenues. So the MSFA controlled those ramps, but as part of and they own those ramps, but as part of the Downtown East deal, we were able to negotiate that MSFA would dedicate those revenues to payment of the city's bonds for the remaining time that those bonds are outstanding. So again, the city's bond issuance is covered for at least the first 10 years by those guaranteed payments from Ryan. Then afterwards, the payments from the ramps will go towards supporting the bond debt service payments. So that's the deal of the Downtown East deal. So you could say 18.8 million issued for the Commons. So what that gets you is basically what we will sometimes call the basic park. That would basically get you a cleared site with some seeded grass, some replaced sidewalk and curb, some street lights, and that's about it. But everybody's aspirations has been for something more than that. And so that's what we hired Hargraves to do, was to come up with the design on that canvas of what would you do. And so that design that they came up with that we unveiled in March and that was attached to this council report is the design that we're working towards. And so the cost for that is more. And what the city is contributing to that would be this $2 million of the design and project management costs that we're already incurring. We're already paying bills for those costs.
I want to make sure, so Councilmember Fry and then Councilmember Bender and I guess Councilmember Goodman had maybe a follow-up on this, if you're quick. Okay, all right, if you're quick.
Mr. Mercer, what happens if the revenue is not adequate to pay the bonds from the parking facilities? The city is at risk then, correct?
Madam Vice President, Councilmember Goodman, that is correct. The city is at risk for those debt service of those bonds.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Fry?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to wait till all the other comments were done so I could answer all the questions all at once if there were any, if that's all right.
You
I just
can
took
step
myself
in
out of
whenever you want.
I just took myself out of line, so yeah.
Okay, all right. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know we've covered this in previous discussions, but I just want to understand. So are you saying we're expected to be paid back in full for the $18.8 million bond that we've issued? I thought there was something like $10 million of land costs for the park that we had sort of anticipated that we were contributing as a city, but is that not correct?
Madam Vice President, Councilmember Bender, the 18.8 million of bonds, we have two expected sources of, we have two sources of revenue that we know that will pay back, that will go towards those. Whether they'll actually pay them back in full or not is yet to be seen because we can't we don't know how the parking revenues will materialize over the next 30 odd years or so of the bond issuance. But at least for that first 10 years, when Ryan is making the payments, given the way that we structured the bond issuance, the payments of at least of those first 10 years match the guaranteed payments from Ryan companies.
How much is the total expected revenue for parking for the first 10 years that we have guaranteed?
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, Councilmember Bender, I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
What is the total estimated cost that we have, or I guess it's not estimated, what is the cost that we have, the payments back for the first 10 years that we have guaranteed from Ryan?
Okay, so
The total amount.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Bender, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking what are the amount of payments and maybe revenue that we expect to get in that first 10 years. I don't have that number at my fingertips.
I have some more questions. So
Go ahead.
what was this? Can you tell us the status of the use agreement with the Vikings and how many days this public facility will not be available to the public?
Vice President, Madam Vice President, Councilmember Bender. So as part of the Downtown East project, there was multiple agreements, and one of which was something called the Urban Park Use Agreement, which was laid out the use of the commons, the use rights of the commons for both the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority as well as the Minnesota Vikings. And in that agreement, it gave both of those parties a certain number of days for use of the commons. And I would say the important thing is use of the commons basically for free, meaning they wouldn't have to pay a rent or a lease or a fee for that use. They would be responsible for some operating costs that from the impact of their use, but they don't have to pay a fee that another party would. What the agreement did was granted the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority up to 40 days per calendar year to hold events for free, basically, in the commons. What it granted the Minnesota Vikings was, and I guess an important thing to also notice, so with the MSFA, it was up to 40 days for the East Block. So there's two blocks to the commons. There's the East Block, the one where the Star Tribune building is coming down right now. It's a full block. And then there's the West Block, which is, it will be the block that shares space with the Ryan residential building that's also being constructed now. So the MSFA has up to 40 days on the East Block. The Minnesota Vikings have both blocks for their home games. So that's preseason, regular season, and if there's any postseason. And in addition to that, they have up to 10 days for both blocks. Sure. Madam Vice President, Councilmember Gordon, sorry, home games. I should use the number, right. So Vikings have, at this point, approximately 10 home games per season, and that's inclusive of 2 preseason and 8 regular season. Yeah, so you can think of that as 10 plus 10 for the Vikings. So approximately 20 days for events, basically at no charge to them, except for incremental expenses from their impact of the use. And that's what the use agreement says. Now, one of the things you asked about was sort of public accessibility. So the Vikings and the MSFA will have use of the commons. They can set up some structures, if to have sort of controlled entry if they have, for example, a place serving alcohol or some sort of fence. But otherwise, from that, the commons must remain publicly accessible.
Okay. My next question is, so assuming we can raise the funding needed for the capital costs of this, what is the plan for maintaining this space into the future? And what is the expectation that the public or general fund or other sources of public funding would be used for maintenance of this facility?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Bender, so your question is about the operating maintenance. So if we are able to raise all the money for the capital to actually build this, our architect-led design team has been looking at with their sub-consultants what the potential operating costs might be. And based on the schematic designs from a couple months ago, they came up with a preliminary estimate about what those operating maintenance costs would be. was on the order of $1.25 million. Now, where would that $1.25 million come from is still to be determined. I think what our architect or our park design team has said is if you look at other urban parks around the country that could be comparable, that you often see a pattern of there's some different buckets where that funding can come from. One is some sort of base level support from the local municipality. Now, what that amount is varies from community to community and will certainly be debated within this community. Two would be some level of philanthropic fundraising. And if we do, in fact, go forward with utilizing the nonprofit conservancy and taking advantage of their nonprofit status, we could raise additional funds to contribute towards the operating costs. So that's 1 and 2. Number 3 is earned income. So there'll be some activities happening in the commons that we hope will earn revenues. So we hope to have a concession building there that be earning revenues. We hope to be making some money off of events for other that the commons actually organizes themselves, and there may be some other buckets of money. So that's the third category. And then a fourth category sometimes is if you look around at the neighboring property owners, that there's often incremental value created for them in terms of their property values or their sales tax receipts. And so in other communities, there's been a looking at, is there a way to sort of tap into that, whether it's through some sort of increment financing, or whether it's through a special taxing district, or whether it's through a special service district or a special assessments. There's sort of different ways you could do it, and depending upon the context of a local municipality, there may be different tools available.
Okay. I mean, I have one more question, but I'll just say I'm uncomfortable with the level of uncertainty about the total amount of public investment here. And then my final question is, what happened when the council approved this expenditure? We expected to be paid back. And so I don't understand what has changed since January. And I wondered if you could explain why we would now be contributing this extra $2 million that had not been anticipated previously. Mm-hmm. It partly because I don't think it bodes well for the plan to hope that we can raise maintenance money and not know how much we're going to be expected to contribute as the city.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Bender, I'm going to turn that over to John Stiles.
Mr. Stiles.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, Councilmember Bender, council members. Mayor Hodges has been chairing the fundraising committee, co-chairing the fundraising committee for some months now, since late winter or spring, with the CEO of Ryan Construction, Pat Ryan, guided by some fundraising consultants that the Downtown Council has engaged. So she has spent quite a few hours a week and month meeting with the kinds of folks that we expect to finance this park. Corporate CEOs, obviously the large players, Wells Fargo, which has a major vested interest, the Minnesota Vikings, but many other companies located in downtown Minneapolis, and many that are not, but are interested in being a partner in this venture. One thing that the mayor heard consistently from people, and with the full knowledge of all the financing that the city has done of this project so far, right? And again, I think that we've been very upfront with everyone that we've spoken to about how far in we are in this project. One piece of feedback that came consistently from these meetings was that those funders and potential funders would like to see some sort of gesture from the city of Minneapolis toward building the design that Hargreaves has put out there that you have approved along the way so far. In thinking through how we could do that, the mayor did not have an interest in putting property tax dollars into her either trying to appropriate them in 2015 or putting them into the 2016 budget. Because Mr. Mercer, and I don't know if you've spoken to this, but because Mr. Mercer successfully applied for grant funding in the total of $1.5 million to help us pay for the mitigation and demolition of the Star Tribune building that would have come out of the $18.8 million in bond proceeds. There is now $1.5 million, if I understand it correctly, available to be spent on commons related expenditures that we did not anticipate would be there. This struck the mayor and the council president, who's not here today, and Councilmember Fry, who are all involved in the fundraising around this issue, as an opportunity for the city to say, we can reimburse ourselves through this money, essentially from the grant money that we received, and bring down the overall cost of the project, and that would be the city's contribution. So it's not a cash expenditure of any kind, but it would go a long way toward paying the Hargraves bill and bringing down the overall cost of the project.
Have we heard from finance what the funding source for this $2 million is?
Ms. Christensen.
Council Vice President Glidden, Councilmember Bender, as Mr. Stiles articulated, the funding source is essentially the original $18 million of bond issuance with the portion that was intended to be used for initial construction. We then were able to garner other resources through the application for grants through DEED and the Met Council. And that did expand our ability to repay ourselves the $2 million. So essentially the $2 million is, one and a half of the $2 million is grant funding. The remaining $500,000 that is bringing the balance to $2 million is essentially sunk cost in the city, whereby the various departments are we're applying staff costs as well as contracts with various consultants that is being paid for out of operational budgets.
What are the other possible uses of the bonding? If we weren't spending this $1.5 million from the bonding capacity on the contract?
It would have been used specifically for the commons because that was the purpose the bonds were issued for. The fact that we were able to garner outside resources through these grants actually expanded our authority, and there was approval received through appropriation when those grants were received.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I have a whole page of questions. I don't know if I have to ask them all now. I did try to reach out to Mr. Mercer before the meeting because I have a lot of concerns about this, and even I'm curious about the design. Did we have an opportunity to have a focus group at the People Serving People residents to find out what their needs and desires were for the park that's going to be half a block away from where they're going to be living? And what was their input?
Madam Vice President, Councilmember Gordon, yeah, the short answer is yes. We did visit with the People Serving People as well as the Manual House building that's just a couple of blocks away from the site of the Commons. And we did that in the context of a broader community survey that we did. So I was talking before about the community engagement process for this design, and that's involved some public, 3 public meetings so far. It's involved meeting with some different stakeholder groups. We've also had some surveys, both online as well as hard copy available. And when we were in the process of doing the surveys, where we were collecting various people's ideas for what would you like to do in the park? What are your use ideas? What are your design ideas? It's a very open-ended survey. We did some targeted outreach to both People Serving People and Emmanuel House, as well as Elliott Park, as well as Mill District Neighborhood, downtown Minneapolis, DMNA, Downtown Minneapolis Neighborhood Association, to try to encourage more survey responses from those different groups. And so I myself went to People Serving People. We tabled during their lunch break, and we got, I can't remember, it was 20 or 30 surveys. With Emmanuel House, I visited with them about 5 o'clock, and they convened a bunch of their residents, and I explained the project to them and also gave them a chance to fill out the surveys.
So you didn't actually have a focus group where you sat down and met with the designers and then, but you did do a survey there. Did you do any survey in Riverside Plaza over on the West Bank?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, we did not visit there in person, but we did send out the survey link to the neighborhood association over there.
Do you have the survey results collected and collated? And could we get access to those? I'm just curious about what's not there. I don't see a basketball hoop. I don't see a barbecue. I don't see a picnic table. I don't see a soccer field. And I'm just curious about why nobody was thinking, what made them think they couldn't hope for something that would actually draw families and kids to the park like that.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, we do have the survey results available, and we've got the results of the Survey Monkey. So that's a PDF document that I'd be happy to share with
That'd
you
be
or others that would like to see that. In terms of your point about particular features, what I would say is one of the design goals and principles that we've been operating under is realizing that this commons has to serve multiple purposes. It needs to be a space that can accommodate events, but also needs to work for the everyday use of residents, downtown workers, visitors. So it needs to be both active and passive. And so if you look at the design, you'll see that a lot of it is open and meant to be to accommodate a range of uses. And so you won't see a lot of sort of, I'll call it sort of equipment installed like a basketball court or jungle gym, but there's certainly space where things can be brought in, whether that is for a market festival or whether you're going to have some sort of sports tournament, whether it's ping pong or curling or, and so that it's meant to be a space that can accommodate a range of uses that are brought in when something's organized around those.
What happens to the fountain area when it's cold? There's that whole big section that looks like it's a sprinkler system that people can run through. So, that it would be pretty hard to imagine somebody playing a baseball on that or soccer or whatever. And in the winter, do we just shut those off? And
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, you're referring to what we call the wet plaza. It's on the western block. When I look at it, plan view, I kind of think it looks like an amoeba. But what that's meant to be is a wet plaza that you can turn on or off. So when you turn it on, the intent is to have a skim of water, about half an inch or so of water that kids of all ages can walk through, play with their shoes. There's also meant to be potentially some water jets or mist jets that come out in certain areas of that for kids to run through. And you would certainly, I would say it would be weather dependent upon when you actually turn it on. But if you're holding an event or when it's winter, you turn the system off. And so then it's just serving basically as an open plaza, hardscaped plaza that can accommodate a range of uses. It'll be right next to where the cafe pavilion building will be. And so we hope that the activity that generates for people to get something to drink or something to eat, people will be hanging out around that pavilion building and may spill out into the wet plaza.
so in the winter, it'll just be a dry sloped piece of kind of a concrete tile thing. But my question was, what do we do with it in the winter? And it sounds like it's just going to be it must be slightly sloped so the water drains, and it's probably going to be an impermeable surface. And so it'll just be there as a plaza, a kind of a hard surface plaza.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, it will be a plaza that can be programmed in a variety of ways. And so I think what you're asking is more of a program operational question. And we can brainstorm a lot of ideas about what we could do in that open space. And I think it provides the flexibility. So we could, in the winter, bring in a temporary ice rink and set it up on there. Now, it wouldn't be taking advantage of the water system of the plaza. We wouldn't want to turn that on. But you can bring in a temporary self-contained ice rink that has its own floor, flood it, and have an ice rink outside. That's just one example of one way to program that.
And so part of what we're having to pay for now to give Brian now is so that they can put in some piping so that we can have that. That must be some of the expense then you were talking about of how we want to have that infrastructure in there. So we'll be putting in water pipes and pumps.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, that is correct. The underground work is basically the utilities. So that's inclusive of water utilities. So the water pipes to feed that plaza, but also water pipes to feed the two buildings. There's going to be an irrigation system set up. There's going to be stormwater management. There's electrical, all sorts of, yeah.
Right. We've got some good experience with fountain pipings at another plaza that we're dealing with. So I have a question. Did we, what was the property appraised at before we came up with the 19.8 million or 18.8 million to buy it? Did we get an appraisal?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, the purchase price for the 19.8 million included a couple of things. It included the price of the land when Ryan Companies purchased it from the Star Tribune.
Did we get an appraisal?
We, the city, did not get an appraisal.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, when the Vikings are going to get to use the Commons for their 20 days and the sports facilities for their 40 days. And for the Vikings, I noticed you said for events. Are they going to get any time to restrict it for setup and tear down? Because
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, your question is, did they get time for setup or takedown? And the answer is yes.
how many days do
For
they
the
get?
Vikings, they get the day before and the day after.
So that 20 will actually turn into 60?
Madam Chair, Councilman Gordon, yes, that's one way to think about it, depending upon how long they need to actually set up and take down.
And 60 plus 40 equals 100?
Madam Chair, Councilman Gordon, that's correct.
Okay, so that's almost a third of the year that it will not, the West Block for 40 days might be open. And the MSFA for their 40 days, they don't get 3 days?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, they don't get 3 days automatically, but they do get time, I believe the agreement says, as reasonably necessary to set up or take down. And they have to make good faith efforts to minimize that time.
What did the council actually authorize when we voted on the number of days that the sports facilities and the Vikings would get it? How many days was in that? Do you recall that?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, that would be in the term sheet that was attached to the council action from December. And I'd be most comfortable if I had that in front of me to answer your question.
I remember voting on something that was closer to 40 days, so I was very surprised when it came back to be 100 days. Who made that deal for the city? Who did we authorize when we voted on our 40 days to go negotiate for us?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, I see I'm happy to try to take a stab at that, or else I will turn it over to the
I
city
believe,
attorney.
as I recall, it was the finance director. Is that correct?
It sounds like Mr. Mercer is saying he doesn't know. And so if Ms. Siegel
All
knows right now, that's fine. And otherwise, let's just continue on.
Okay.
Okay.
It just occurs to me that this opportunity, before we're deciding to soak a lot more money into the commons, would give us a good opportunity to go back and look at what are the terms of this agreement we made. All of a sudden, we're putting in more money, we're taking over more of this, Ryan's involved and the Vikings are involved. When I served on the council in December and we voted on what we wanted to be negotiated, it was keeping the vast majority of those days open to the public. That's what I felt comfortable about. That's what I wanted to do. We then authorized someone to go negotiate on our behalf, and it came back tripling that number, or doubling it at least. It was significantly increasing. I can't remember, and neither can you, the exact number we authorized in December. So I've been looking for an opportunity to say, okay, maybe there's a chance we can review this. And I think this might give us a chance to review it before we start digging ourselves in deeper and contributing more money. I'm also curious about the parking ramp. What are the Vikings paying during games for parking? Are they going to be paying? Are we going to be getting revenue when their fans come and pay for parking there in the parking ramp we're building for the sports facilities?
And I just want to say, I want to hold the questions to this item around the commons. So maybe this is the last one that kind of goes a little bit beyond to the broader financing of the deal, unless you find a way to connect your question to the commons.
I was pretty sure that we were using
Okay.
the parking ramp to finance and fund the commons. I'm
All
pretty
right,
sure
so
that the
that's how
parking
you're-
ramp is tied right into that. That's going to be key. That's actually how we're going to pay for purchasing it. And I think there were even hopes at the time that we were going to be using revenue from the parking to help pay for maybe some maintenance or some other ongoing things that would go in there. That we were seeing this as a revenue stream to support the commons, at least to pay the bonds off for buying the land that was there. And so I'll just cut to the chase, I guess. I was also surprised to hear the terms that came back when we negotiated what the Vikings would be paying. And it sounds like there's some of the fans that won't have to pay for parking in the ramp during the games. And maybe you're not aware of that. But my point is, this seems like an opportunity for us to also say, well, maybe we need to look back. All of a sudden, we're getting in deeper dealing with your this plaza that I think part of it was required by the legislature to support the stadium. So we already put all this money into the stadium to have the required plaza and the parking, and now we're putting in additional money on top of that. So it just, the deal just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And it seems like we're in a position right now where we could say, wait a second, we see that, we want this to work out really well, and you probably do too. And now maybe it's time to come back and look at some of these commitments that we made and renegotiate before we make more commitments.
Okay.
But you don't have to answer the questions because I can.
I think I'll take that as a comment.
Yeah, that's a comment. And I've several more questions, but I will give everybody some
Thank you.
extra time this
There's a
morning.
couple other people in queue. So Councilmember Frye.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll hopefully going to address several of the points that were made. And Mr. Mercer, you've done a wonderful job addressing them so far. But I just also wanted to put into context why some of these decisions were made. And also, I wanted to express my appreciation for all the questions asked so far because they are the right ones. First is the design. Well, you know what? Let me take a step back and first explain the motion that will be before you on Friday. So back in, was it January or February? Just to be very exceedingly clear here, we, CDRS, and then through the full council, gave authorization for a contract to be entered with Hargreaves to the tune of approximately $1.8 million. It says it in the motion, and I also believe I verbally said that this money, we anticipated that this money would be replenished once the fundraising came forward. Subsequently, while working with the mayor, myself, Councilmember Johnson, as well as the rest of the fundraising committee, it became exceedingly apparent that having seed money from the get-go would enable a greater amount of private investment to go into the park, hopefully to the tune of $22 million. That's approximately 16 of capital costs, and then another 3 to 4 to 5 of for maintenance and operations up front. So this $2 million, the thought was that this $2 million would trigger additional investments that we wouldn't otherwise get to make this not just a dirt and grass park with pigeons flying around, but something exceptional. Councilmember Gordon addressed the design, and I believe Miles Mercer addressed it. The intent was to have flexible space. We've got the Great Lawn. While you couldn't have a full soccer field there, you can have a good chunk of one. You can do many, many different activities in there. Adjacent to the Great Lawn on the river side is programmable space, which is also flexible. It can be used to you can put barbecues there. Councilmember Goodman asked about, Gordon asked about children. There's several things that are focused on children. One is there are mounds that are on the west block, and these mounds supposedly are children use these mounds really even more than playgrounds themselves. They absolutely love them. And then on top of that, there are crates or boxes that we anticipate having where the children can go in, they can take activities, balls, games, building blocks out of these crates, and then they can be used on a regular basis, predominantly through the nicer half of the year. The plaza space is also flexible. You can put an ice skating rink there in the winter. In the summer, it's there has a misting aspect. So the design itself is flexible. I wanted to address the engagement. There was extensive engagement on this one. Obviously we didn't get every single person in the entire city, but Hargreaves and Associate made it clear that not only was the engagement good, but it was record engagement from every single other city that they've ever participated in. Minneapolis had the most, and probably that speaks more for the city of Minneapolis than it does for engagement process, but nonetheless, a lot of people responded. And then finally, the status of the agreement, and this is the use agreement that I'm referencing. So as Mr. Mercer referenced, the Vikings have both blocks for the 10 days. Additionally, per the agreement, they have the ability to set up and tear down tents the day before and the day after. But it became pretty apparent that this was not the best use for the public, given the lack of accessible days. But the Vikings weren't crazy about this putting up and taking down the tents 20 times a year either. And there is, we are hopefully moving forward, and by we, I mean really the Hennepin County moving forward to an agreement to use the medical examiners or the morgue parcel, which is just adjacent to the facility, to permanently have tents through the NFL season, thus opening the park for the entirety of the days. So that means no tenting of the park during Vikings game days or the day before or the day after. Permanent tenting of the medical examiner's block, which is presently a surface parking lot. That opens a ton of days. When you hear about these 120 days that the Vikings that are not publicly accessible, it also incorporates the anticipation of having a soccer team at the Viking Stadium, which we're certainly not going to have at the Viking Stadium, and we may not even have in the city. And next was the MSFA. The MSFA does have up to 40 days to use just the East blocks. That's not the West block. The West block would still be accessible. And on the East block, just because the MSFA has access, one, doesn't mean that they'll use it, but two, even on days when they do use it, it doesn't necessarily mean inaccessible to the public. And I'll give you an example of a flea market. A flea market could take place on an MSFA day. A rally could take place preceding an event at the stadium on an MSFA day, yet is still fully accessible to the public. Finally, I agree with my colleagues that the use agreement is not ideal in its entirety. And I do think there is potential to renegotiate certain terms that would allow the park to be more publicly accessible, one, and two, generate more revenues. I'm happy to, I've been talking for a while, I'd be happy to share more about with that offline. And finally, in terms of operations and maintenance, which Councilmember Bender brought up, as Miles pointed out, presently there's a fundraising campaign. About $4 million of those dollars would go to initial operations and maintenance. There is the potential for assessments as per the stadium legislation. There is parking legislation as well that will hopefully be moving forward in the next session that would cover well in excess of the 1.2 anticipated for the funding of the park. And, you know, I'm not saying this is 100% figured out right now because it's not, but we're on the way. And the motion that was made in the CDRS committee, as Councilmember Glidden referenced, was made in the interest of transparency. That's the reason I made the motion, to make it exceedingly clear what we were doing, so that if anyone had a problem with it, and clearly some do, we could have the debate.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councilmember Frye. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick clarifying question about the use of these days. So you said that means these days would be used free of charge. That eliminates approximately 100 days from the year, or perhaps less if we're able to negotiate this tear down, put up and take down issue, where we would not be getting revenue from the users of the space. And wouldn't those mostly be during warm weather season? So what is the estimation for our ability to raise funds for maintenance based on fee revenue from use in the wintertime or the 200 remaining days of the year?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Bender, two thoughts. One is, yes, the Vikings will clearly use their use days during their football season, and we have a general idea of when that's going to occur. When they might use their other days, or when the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority might use their days, is undetermined at this point. And the urban park use agreement, in addition to giving them these use days, also lays out a fairly detailed process of scheduling events. And I won't go into the details here, but there's basically opportunities for both the MSFA and the Vikings to try to schedule events, as well as whoever the operator of the Commons is to schedule our events. So yes, would everybody want to try to have their events when it's better weather? Yes, I think that's a fair assumption. But the specific process of actually booking those events is yet to occur, and will be determined as we actually operationalize the scheduling of events. Your second question was about sort of what is the capability, what's the potential of raising earned income or fees from the holding of events in the commons. And so as part of the Hargraves design team, in addition to looking at what the potential operating costs of the commons, there's also a sub-consultant looking at what's the potential earned income, basically the revenue possibilities for the commons. And so they've been looking at a couple of different revenue streams, one of which is concessions, another one which is holding events. So they have an estimate taking into consideration the constraints from the urban park use agreement about what you could raise. I'd say it's on the order of tens of thousands of dollars, around $50,000, I believe it was. Now, it all depends upon how this all operationalizes. It didn't really take into account what happens, as Councilmember Fry talked about, with the changing dynamics with the medical examiner's parcel and how that may impact how many days actually get used by the Vikings and or the MSFA. But the fee from the event use is part of a bundle of revenue streams that we are still analyzing, trying to get a handle on.
Okay, I'm not seeing anybody else in queue. I had one last question. I still am a little bit fuzzy on kind of what were the allowable uses of some of this money. So I apologize, but I'm going to ask you one more time about that, because I don't see this grant that was received referred to in the RCA, and my eyes could be glancing over it, but I'm not seeing that. So tell me again, what was that grant and that we received, and what was that for? And what did that allow the grant to be used for? What would have been how we paid for whatever that grant would have been used for, is used for?
Right, Madam Vice President, I said earlier, the budget for I'll call it the basic park, sort of just the flat grass, this the cost it takes for us to acquire the property and have it be cleared and make some basic improvements. I said before that was, I believe I said that was, the city issued approximately 18.8 million in bonds for that portion. So it was part of a broader bond issue, but the portion going to the commons for that basic park acquisition and site prep was 18.8.
Mm-hmm.
So that 18.8 consists of buying the land, abating the Star Tribune building, so abating the asbestos that's in it, demolishing it, replacing sidewalks, curbs, putting in some street lights, putting in some basic electrical utilities, putting in a basic irrigation system, putting in some street lights. Those are the various sort of scope items included in that number. The grant that was referred to as were environmental cleanup grants that the city was able to successfully apply for. One was a $1 million grant from Met Council for abatement of the Star Tribune building, and a $500,000 grant from Minnesota DEED for demolition of the Star Tribune building. So there was part of the issue here was timing, that we needed to issue the bonds before we knew about the outcome of those grant applications. And so the city issued those bonds in an amount sufficient to cover that $18.8 million. But subsequent to the bond issuance, we received the two grants. And so that meant that we didn't have to spend the bond proceeds on those abatement and demolition costs, and therefore freed up some room in the bond proceeds. And I think, as Sandy Christensen said, those bond proceeds are meant to be spent on the Downtown East Commons project. And so it had to be spent on some sort of related project cost.
Okay. And then just so I follow this through, if there is or would not have been in the committee a decision on donating this $2 million to the fundraising project, what would have happened? Okay, you've already issued the bonds, you've got the grant, which is good. So play through for me, what would be the implication to the city if we didn't do that?
Madam Chair, just to make sure I understand your question, what would be the implication if we didn't approve the $2 million?
Yep. as being donated to.
as being donated. And if we maintained our expectation that we were going to get that money to be replenished from the fundraising committee, I guess it's hard to talk in hypotheticals, but I guess, based on what Mr. Stiles said earlier about the importance to the other funders of seeing some additional city money going into the project, you could question whether they would have been willing to put in the money, or at least the amount of money that they did themselves. So, would we have even reached the $7 million announcement?
Okay.
The fundraising announcement that we
So
came.
that's about the fundraising. What about just sort of the implications to the project itself or to the city's finances? That's actually more where I was going.
Council Vice President Glidden, as Mr. Mercer indicated, originally the bonds were issued with the intent of there being approximately $18.8 million associated with construction of the park and related downtown east expenditures. With the addition of the deed grant and the Met Council grant that were appropriated subsequent to the issuance of the bonds, there would be $19.3 million approximately available for work associated with the Commons and work in downtown East. Were these funds not to be used for the purpose of the match or the city's contribution or some other related purpose, as is being asked to be approved in this RCA, those funds could be redirected for some other related purpose specific to the Commons and the Downtown East project. But because of the restrictions on the bond proceeds, they would need to be used in the project area. Certainly could be used for some other aspect of the project, but they have to be used for that project. So it's either this or something else.
Thank you. So like they could be used for infrastructure improvements as an example.
Yep.
Okay, good to know. Thank you very much. Thank everyone for their indulgence on a long discussion here. I will say it kind of bothers me that we don't talk more about the city's very large investment in this project already and how that is a seeding of the project. We're the ones who are taking the risk. We don't know until many decades in the future if our risk is repaid, and that's the chance that we chose to take because we believed in this project. And I am one who voted for this project because I thought it was a good concept. So I just want to put that out there. And I also feel still perplexed about why this significant decision about expenditure of funds didn't come to the Ways and Means Committee. I totally don't understand that one, and I guess I'll ask staff about that after the fact. So $2 million is a lot of money. We can all kind of draw the comparisons of what it can be used for, but thank you for the weighty discussion, all of my colleagues. We do have other reports, and the next is Health, Environment, and Community Engagement from Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. We just have two things we're bringing forward. One is authorizing contracts having to do with National Diabetes Prevention Program, and the other is confirming appointments to the Minneapolis Advisory Committee on Aging.
All right, thank you. Next, we have intergovernmental relations, and there was one item there, which was a funding agreement with the Fair Housing Implementation Council Cooperative for Fair Housing Services. Next, we have Transportation and Public Works with Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The committee will be forwarding 9 items for full consideration. Item 1 is the Recycling Processing Services RFP. Item 2 is the temporary use agreement with Minnesota Department of Transportation. Item 3 is the authorizing amendment to a contract with Zoll Petroleum Maintenance, and that's an amendment for the total contract. Item 4 is the Water Plant Exterior Stabilization Project. Item 5 is the Hennepin-Lyndale Corridor Reconstruction Project Design Contract Amendment. Item 6 is the Lynn Lake Municipal Parking Lot Impact Fees. Item 7 is the Car Sharing Pilot Program Contract Extension with Car2Go and Our Car. And item 8 is the Recycling Refund Policy Agreement with Hennepin County, and there's an amendment to that. And then the final item is a bid for a stormwater pump station rehabilitation project, and that was a low bid from Vite. The details are before you. All stand for questions, Madam Vice President.
All right, thank you for that. Next, we have Ways and Means with Councilmember Quincy. Oh, I am sorry, there was a question, Councilmember Benzer.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I just wanted to give a heads up that on item number 7, we had a very brief staff presentation about our, before we had a motion to extend our car sharing contracts through February, and we do not have any commitment to resolve the many policy questions actually about these contracts before that time. And I learned since then that one company, Car2Go, has been requesting to meet with staff since earlier in the spring, in April. So that would be almost a full year from when they first requested to revisit some of the terms of their contract, which include, for example, a $400 per year per car payment for the ability to park in critical parking areas. They pay for the full cost of on-street parking. And they are interested in, as their contract, it's expiring now, September 11th, they had hoped to have a renegotiated contract in place by then, which includes some policy decisions about whether or not we're going to require this private company to operate in the entire city and what that means if we are going to require them to use their business model, which is very different than the other car sharing companies throughout the entire city, or where we would allow them to operate the same way that our car and Zipcar do in some parts of the lower density residential areas of the city, and then sort of what we would be negotiating in exchange for those, for that service. So anyway, there's a significant number of policy questions that were not included in the staff presentation that we had at TPW. So I'm going to be working before Friday with Chair Reich and staff. I've talked with Director Kotke, who shares the concern about not having a timeline, to suggest a more truncated timeline to bring forward some of these policy questions for consideration at TPW and the council, hopefully by the end of October.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Ways and Means.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Ways and Means bring forward 7 items for consideration on Friday. The first 3 are settlement items. The 4th item is the Flower Exchange building contract amendment. This terminates our first right of refusal at the request of the building owner. The last 3 items, 5, 6, and 7, are related to, from the IT department. They bring forward request for actions on a single bid for Norstrand Communications for telephone system software and equipment upgrades, Risk Master software contract amendment, and contract amendment again with Norstock, or first time contract with Norstrand. This is on service and the help and service desk implementation. Happy to answer any questions on those 7 items. Also wanted to point out that at the conclusion of our Ways and Means Committee, we convened the first of our Budget Committee meetings, and we had an extensive conversation and presentation from our Finance Department on the budget overview, and then as well as capital investments within the 2016 budget. So we'll continue those budget meetings as we start our department budget hearings on September 18th.
Okay, thank you very much. Last, we have Zoning and Planning with Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We have 4 items from Zoning and Planning. The first is a variance appeal for a parking lot sign at 5025 Knox Avenue South. The committee voted to deny that appeal from the Zoning Board of Adjustment. Item number 2 was denying an appeal which would have allowed for the demolition of an historic resource, which is a series of grain silos owned by the Riverland Agricultural Corporation. Item number 3 was approving an application for rezoning at 2720 University Avenue Southeast from OR2 to C2. And then item number 4 is a vacation for part of an alley at 33rd Avenue Northeast and Taylor Street Northeast. Happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much. If I'm correct, there are no questions. And with that, I believe we've concluded with our agenda. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.